In this DOM and web category section, I am discussing a very important topic related to input element events. There will be 5 relative questions to this topic. Whenever you make a web application or a page, you will always have different types of input elements like text box, checkbox, radio button, etc. And because you have these elements, you also have a fantastic range of events to deal with user input. First two such events I am discussing are onFocus and onBlur events. When an element receives focus or when cursor is placed on the element, the onFocus event is fired for that particular element. OnBlur is opposite to onFocus. That is, when an element loses the focus, the onBlur event is fired. Let's check it practically. I'm continuing with the same previous application where I have a division and there is an H1 where I'm displaying the event status. Now I have placed two text boxes here. The first text box has both the events configured. The first event I have written is onFocus, where I am calling the eHandler function and passing a text onFocus. The second event I have configured with the same text box is onBlur. That means when I come out of the text box, it should display onBlur in the H1 because the eHandler is called and there is a message passed and I am receiving the onBlur text in message and that I am displaying in the H1. So let me just save this code quickly and go to the output. Here is the output now. Now when I click here, you see that onFocus is displayed. Let me also try to come out of the text box and see what happens. It says onBlur. So when the cursor comes inside this text box, the onFocus is fired, and when it loses the focus, the onBlur is fired. Now comes the very important event, and that is the onChange event and also onInput event. The onChange event is generally configured with drop-down list, that is the select and option. But it can be attached with the text box, checkbox or even radio buttons. For text box, the change event is fired when it loses the focus. So then what is the difference between onBlur and onChange? That is a question, but that we will discuss once we configure the event. So now let's try onChange here. At the moment I am keeping onFocus as it is, and instead of onBlur I will just say onChange. And here also I will change the text. I'll say onChange. Let's go to the output. The moment I come in the text box, the onFocus is fired. Now let me just type some text here and I come out of the text box. So the onChange is also fired. So you might think that what's the difference between onBlur? This is same as onBlur, but that's not the case. Let me show you that also. I am going back to the text box. You see, now it says onFocus, that's fine. Now I do not change the text here. I do not make any changes to this text box. And if I come out, you will observe that the onChange is not fired. If this was onBlur, then it would have executed. But right now, because I have written the code on onChange, that gets fired when the element loses the focus, but provided that there is a change in the value. So let me try to change a value. Let's say I cancel T and again I go out. Then the onChange is fired. So the onBlur also gets fired on losing the focus. Same does the onChange, but onChange is fired when there is also some content changed in the element. That is the major difference. So the onChange is also very useful for other elements as well. Let me add a checkbox here. Instead of this text box, I'll just say checkbox. Now what I want is I'm going to call the onChange on the checkbox also, and here again I'm going to call the eHandler. Now I want to pass the value of the checkbox, that is whether the checkbox is checked or not. How can I do that? If you want to get the status of checkbox, that is it checked or not, you can get that by using a checked property. So what will I do? I will say this. That means it is going to refer the checkbox itself, and that has the property called checked. That means if the checkbox is checked, it will send true, otherwise it will send false. Let me also add some text here. I'll say check me, right? And also put a break here. So I'll say break. So it comes on a new line. Now I'll refresh. Now see this, click. You see the event is fired and it has passed the checked value. Again click. Now it says false. So every time I change, the content is changed of checkbox. So it does call it, and then I am passing the value of checkbox. Now let's try the event with radio buttons. Let's have two radio buttons. I'll put a break tag and we'll have a radio button. So I'll say radio 1 and input type is equal to radio. Let me also have a value property here. I'll say radio 1. Now I'm going to create group of it. So I'll say name is equal to same, because the next radio will also have the same group, that is name will be R only. Now I say on change. I'm going to call the e-handler. What I want is I want to pass the value of radio button, that is it checked or not. But which radio is checked? For that I will also pass this dot value. I'll join it with a dash maybe, and this dot check. That means the status, whether it is checked or not. Let me convert this into single quotes so that it doesn't give any issue. All right. And now I'm going to end this radio button. I'll just copy and paste it. And this I will name as radio 2. This name will be same because it's a common group. And here I'll say radio 2. Both have on change. The value will be radio 1 and radio 2. Let's save and refresh. Now if I click on this, you see it says radio 1 and that is true. Next is radio 2 is true. So on change event, that means the content is changed, and that's the reason why it is getting fired. This is a very common thing, but mainly the on change event is used extensively with drop down list, that is the select and option. So let me quickly use a select and option here. I'll say break, select, on change. I'm going to call the e-handler. Let me keep it as it is for the moment because there is something else I want to discuss here. Now I'm going to say option, which you already know how the options are created. I'll say list item 1 and so on. Let me also have a value here. I'll say value is equal to 1, and this I will repeat at least 4 times. I'll say list 1 2 3 4 2 3 4, and for each option I'm going to give different values 2 3 and 4. That's it. Now when a drop down list is present in your page and when there is a change in the item, the on change will handle it. Let's say I just want to pass the value, so naturally I'm going to say this dot value. So for each option the value is given and that value will be assigned. Let me also give some CSS to this with input. I have already given some input element CSS, so I will use the group selector and will write select as well. So the same CSS will be applied to select as well. Also let me increase the height of the division so there is a decent color for all the elements. Let me refresh. Here we have the list. Now if I click any of the list, you see the value is displayed. You see this list 4. So the value is displayed. Now the question here is, what if I want to get the value of this list itself instead of value property? So whichever item is selected, I want the text of this. Let's say list 2 is selected, then I want list 2 here. There is an options property which is available, which contains an array of all the items. And there is also one more property called selected index. So it is something like this. So looking at the figure, you can understand that internally options is like this and each element can be referred using the selected index. So what I can do, I can, instead of passing this dot value, I can say this dot options, which is actually an array, and that has the index number, which is the selected index, and I want the text of that selected index. Let me save this and refresh the page. Now if I click, you see the data is appearing as we are expecting. Also, if I just move the cursor here, if the value is changing, then the event is fired. I'm just using the up and down arrow and you can see that the event is executed. So that's how onChange can be used with various elements. There is also one more event which can be used for text boxes, and that event is onInput. So let me quickly talk about that also. I'm going to put one more text box here. I'll say input type equals to text, and on input we are going to have the e-handler, and I can pass the value here. Whatever value one enters in the text box, that we get it. Now on input is somewhat like a key press or maybe key up, that is a keyboard event. That means every character you press, the on input is fired. Let me just go to the output, refresh the screen. Here is the on input event. You see this? Every time I type something, it gets fired. So on input is a very commonly used event with text box. If you are comparing it with key press or maybe key up, then there is again a major difference. And the difference is the input here can be given by, let's say, Control V. That is, I am pasting the content, right? Or maybe I might use some voice input, right? In all the cases, whether you paste it, whether somebody adds the data by speaking, in all the ways, the on input is fired, whereas the key press will not fire in such cases. So key press anyway is not used often these days, but key up is kind of event, or maybe key down. If you are comparing it with on input, that on every character it changes, then the major difference is that even when you right click and paste it, for example, again I paste it, then it gets fired. Every time I say paste, or maybe let's say paste this way, Control V, then also input is fired. This doesn't happen with the key press events. Now let's discuss relative questions of this topic. The first question is, what is the difference between on blur and on change event? So the on blur gets fired on losing the focus, same does the on change, but on change is fired when there is also some content changed in the element. That is the major difference. The second question is, how will you handle events of checkbox and radio buttons? Well, we have already seen that we can use the on change event for text box, for checkbox, or even radio buttons. For checkbox and radio buttons, you can also use the click event as well. So it depends on the type of event, but yes, on change is one of the event which is generally used with checkbox and radio like elements. The third question is, differentiate on key press or on key up and on input event. So as I just mentioned that when we use the on key up, if somebody, let's say, right clicks and paste the content, or maybe the audio, that is the voice input, is going to the text box, in those cases the on key up or key press will not be fired. Whereas on input is a kind of event which fires in all the cases when there is an input by any media, be it Control V or maybe the voice input. The fourth question is, which event you prefer with the select, that is the drop down list. So on change is one of the event which you can use often with the select, that is the drop down list. The fifth question is, how will you get the text value of selected item from a select element, that is a drop down list. So this was the code we tried, that is we use the options array and we use the selected index to get the current value of the drop down list.